How much degrees cost now compared to what they cost in 2004 and 1984? An arts degree now costs $50,976. In 2004, it cost $11,304. In 1984, it was free. A commerce degree now costs $50,976. In 2004, it cost $15,726. In 1984, it was free. A law degree now costs $50,976. In 2004, it was $18,849. In 1984, it was free. The cost of some degrees, like arts, commerce and law, has more than doubled in the last 5 years. In that same time, rents have increased by 35% and the median house price has doubled. This is not a normal time to be a young person, and my generation risks being the first to leave the world less well off than we found it. One way that we can give the next generation some hope for the future is by making university and tertiary education more affordable. Students shouldn't have to choose between affording the necessities and affording an education, but that's what they're having to do right now. It's time for us to halve the cost of arts degrees, commerce degrees, psychology degrees, law degrees, and cut the price of a lot of other degrees as well. We have to make education affordable for the next generation.
Authorised by Monique, Hawthorne East.
I won't be supporting the government's legislation to ban social media access for children aged less than 16. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm a parent of 3 young people, but also a former paediatrician and medical researcher, and I do not believe that this legislation will be effective or that it is advisable, safe or well thought through. Basically, the point of this legislation is the fact that we know that social media can cause harm. We know that cyberbullying and other forms of injury can be inflicted on digital platforms, and we know that young people aren't at this point being protected well enough from the potential harms that can occur on social media platforms. So it's very reasonable that we look at this, and as a parent and a paediatrician, I'm all in favour of the government doing that. But I really think that we do it in a way that's sensible, that's informed by expert evidence, that takes into account the wishes of young people and their contribution to the discussion, and which sets out very clearly appropriate protections for data and for privacy, none of which are in the bill that the government has put in front of the House. Basically what the government is proposing is to hand over to digital platforms the ability to undertake age assurance or age verification to make sure that young people are under 16, and if that's the case, lock them out from Insta, TikTok, Facebook, and a number of other platforms. You can still have messaging apps and some gaming platforms, but most of the other ones will be gone. I don't think that this is the right way to go about this. I think what we need to do is to keep young people safe when they're online, and the first step towards that would be a digital duty of care, which is something that Zoe Daniel and I put a piece of legislation about in front of the House yesterday. What that would do is put restrictions on the platforms and how they act, which would keep younger people more safe. It's what the experts are in favour of. There are many academic groups and other groups associated with young people who are recommending that we start there rather than starting with a blanket ban. If we just ban it, we know young people are going to get around it. Just banning it takes away the impetus for the platforms to increase their protections, because they can just say, oh, well, young people aren't supposed to be there. When young people do find themselves there on the platforms, there'll be at increased risk if we put a blanket ban in place. So, look, there's lots of reasons to push back on this one. I really think it's a major problem that the government is pushing it through really, really quickly with the support, apparently, of the opposition, even though so many young people in Australia have asked us not to do this. There was a Senate inquiry open for 24 hours earlier this week. Apparently, it received 15,000 submissions. None of those will be looked at before Parliament considers this bill this week. And for that reason alone, the lack of consultation, the fact that the government is not listening to the young people of Australia, I will not be supporting this bill. So the government used $14.5 billion of your taxpayer money to subsidise fossil fuels last year. Here's some other things that it could do with that money. Build 53,000 public housing units. Buy 439.2 million copies of Charlie XCX's recent album, Brat, on vinyl. Build 29,000 acres of solar farms. That would give us enough clean energy to power 9,700,000 homes for a year. Remove 103 level crossings. Buy 29 million level 1 AFL Grand Final tickets. Award the Timothy Chalamet lookalike prize money 290 million times. Include comprehensive dental coverage in Medicare, twice over. See Wicked in the cinema 591 million times. Or they could just cut HECS debts by $14.5 billion, which would save everyone with a HECS debt at least $5,000 each. It's a disgrace that the government makes more from students than it does from polluting fossil fuel companies. When I went to university, it was free. Now students are paying more for their tertiary education than polluting fossil fuel companies are paying to take our oil and our gas from the ground. The federal government has been collecting more in money from our HECS debts than it has from the Petroleum Resources Rent Tax. That applies to both the Labor and the coalition governments. We need to make it harder, not easier, for fossil fuel companies to dodge paying tax in this country. And we shouldn't be giving fossil fuel companies our taxpayer dollars to destroy our climate. This has probably been the most important and terrifying week in Australian politics for years, thanks to Peter Dutton. Earlier this week, Peter Dutton said a line in an interview which marks the most extreme climate position that we've heard in this country for over a decade. He said, "There's no sense in signing up to targets you don't have any prospect of achieving." Those 15 words have single-handedly reignited the Australian climate wars. Let me briefly explain. Australia, along with 193 other countries, has signed up to a landmark agreement. It's called the Paris Agreement. Peter Dutton's comments over the weekend raised the prospect of Australia withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. Only 3 other countries have done that: Iran, Libya, and Yemen. So yesterday, Peter Dutton attempted to clarify his position on emissions reduction by telling us that he wouldn't tell us what his target was until after the next federal election. Asked about what is effectively the most important defining issue of our times, Peter Dutton said, "I'm not going to tell you what I'm thinking until after you vote for me." Can we just pause for a second and appreciate how ridiculous that is? Peter Dutton is going to what is effectively one of the most important elections of our lifetime and not telling us what he thinks about the most important issue in that election until after it happens. That's not how democracy works. Even the coal and gas industries came out today and said that they want Peter Dutton to stick to the existing 2030 target. I think it's pretty obvious that Peter Dutton and Barnaby Joyce are not telling us what their emission target might be because they know that we won't like it. In fact, even as Peter Dutton was talking about this, new analysis was released which showed that his policies would result in emission of 2 billion additional tonnes of carbon dioxide, which would accelerate global warming. Australia already has the cheapest renewable electricity in the world, and we have amazing resources with our wind and our sun. If we extend them and we take full advantage from them, we can all have the cheapest electricity in the world. That's the future that we could have for the next generation. But unfortunately, we're now again going to go into the next election at a time where not everyone's on the same page. The climate wars are back.
You're trying to support younger generations. Why are you so passionate about this?
Oh, look, I'm passionate about it because essentially I think we've screwed things up for the next generation. People say that the kids of today aren't working hard, but my premise is that they're working just as hard as the kids of my generation did, but they've got it much, much, much harder. The reality is that if you want to buy a house now, it costs 9 times the median income to do that. When I was in my 20s, it was 4 times. It cost twice as much of your income proportionately to rent a home. And when I started university, it was free. Now the average HECS debt is $26,000. It's out of control. And what we're seeing is that young people are putting off starting university, they're putting off buying a home, and they're putting off starting a family. What we need to do is to make things more fair for them. But what we have seen is that they're up against it in almost every way. And young people are telling me that they're beginning to lose hope. My generation is at serious risk of leaving the next generation worse off than we found it. And we'd be the first generation ever to do that. And so I feel incredibly passionate about this, as you can tell. And I'm trying to push my colleagues to take action to address intergenerational inequity.
There's news today that for the first time ever in Australia, an arts degree costs $50,000. The cost of arts, law and a lot of other humanities degrees is more than twice what it was a few years ago. And that's one of the reasons why HECS debts have become such a massive issue. The average university graduate now carries their HECS debt into their 40s. And the average HECS debt is now more than $26,000. We have to give young people more hope for the future. Young people are facing record rents. They're losing hope of ever owning their own home. They're putting off going to university and they're putting off starting families of their own. And now they're being saddled with decades of debt for doing a 3-year arts degree. We're seriously screwing things up for the next generation, and what's frustrating is that many of the fixes are relatively simple, especially when it comes to HECS and to university studies. You might not be too surprised to know why these degrees have become so expensive. It's all Scott Morrison's fault. In 2021, Scott Morrison and his education minister looked at our education system and they decided that arts, law, history, philosophy and economics degrees weren't that important to us. And so it was reasonable to double the cost of those degrees. At that time, the cost of an arts degree increased by 113%, and 40% of university students found that their fees had increased significantly. These HECS debts are really hard to pay off, and this has become a wicked problem. It's important that young Australians go to university and TAFE. We need the qualifications and the knowledge that they get from their tertiary education. But instead, we're punishing them. Australia collects more money from HECS than it does from its major fossil fuel tax. It's unfair, and it's holding this generation back. And where we need to start is by scrapping the Job Ready Graduates program, which is the Scott Morrison era scheme, which massively increased the cost of so many of our university degrees.